welcome everyone. It's great to see such a big crowd as the semester gets late and people get busy. This is the second to last event in our Oral History Workshop series. I'm Amy Starcheski. I'm the Associate Director of the Oral History Master's Program here at Columbia. And this series is part of the coursework for our master's students and also obviously is open to the public. So I'm going to pass around the sign-up sheet. If anyone is here that's not on our listserv or wants to hear more about our work, please do sign in. I also want to mention that this event is co-sponsored by the Communications PhD program at the Journalism School and is part of the Paul F. Lazarsfeld lecture series, which explores exciting new ways of combining methodologies in the humanities and the social sciences. So of all the events that we're presenting this semester, I think Andrea Dixon sort of embodies that in the most powerful way, and I'm so excited to hear what she has to say tonight. Andrea is a recent graduate of our master's program in oral history here at Columbia. Before that, she worked in public radio broadcasting and production for Georgia Public Radio and This American Life, right? And she did a master's thesis here on how individual social networks change over time, and for that she did something really innovative methodologically in that she combined network analysis and cognitive mapping, right? To show how these social networks looked and then to show new things about how they changed over time at a gifted girls program called Mary Baldwin. So she's currently a doctoral candidate in the PhD program in communications here at the Journalism School. And for that, she's explored the epistemology of interviewing, comparing and contrasting journalism and oral history. And she's interested broadly in the philosophy of social science. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and please make yourselves comfortable.
Thank you so much, Amy. I thank you and OHMA's co-founder, Mary Marshall Clark, for this opportunity to talk to you about my research interest and my dissertation work. It's amazing to see all here. It's really a pleasure. So let me get right into it. My talk will consider two approaches to oral history interviewing that acknowledge the social world. These approaches are the Sociology of Knowledge and social epistemology. So for those of you who are less familiar with oral history, let's begin with the most basic question. What is oral history interviewing?
So what's the difference between an oral history interview and any other type of interview, a journalist interview, for example?
Well, every interview is a conversation between two or more people, just like we're having right now. But in an oral history interview, we have a different objective in mind. We're trying to get the person to really speak expansively about their experiences and their memories. Journalists frequently have very specific questions, and they really would prefer short answers and to the point. In an oral history interview, we're going to ask open-ended questions, and we hope that the person will talk a lot. In fact, we would prefer that 90% of the interview be spoken by the interview subject, which would be quite different from a journalist's interview.
Are there any other differences between these types of interviews?
Yes, there really are several differences. The product of an oral history interview is going to be a lightly edited transcript of the interview that will go into the archives where researchers can come in and read it. A journalist does his interview, usually tapes it, or maybe just takes notes, and draws out the few quotations that he needs for his story, or she needs, and that's usually it. They're on to another story the next day, and the interview is forgotten. In the case of the oral history interview, we are hoping that it will be used by many people in the future. So we are going to prepare a transcript. We're going to let the interviewee review that transcript, correct errors, and if there are any parts of it that they're not comfortable with, we'll let them restrict it for a time. We'd rather have the interview for the future than sacrifice not getting it just simply because the person isn't comfortable with some of the things they might have said. We'll also have the person sign a legal document in which they give us permission to let other people read the interview and quote from it, and in some cases they sign their copyright interest in the interview over to the university, which is a legal transfer of their property in the interview. And that's very different than most other interviews.
So did you conduct some of these interviews for the project yourself?
Yes, I did, and I was able to interview.
So that was a pretty straightforward primer of the oral history interview from Penn State archivist and historian, oral historian Lee Stout. And the term oral history refers, as he said, to both the one-on-one, generally face-to-face interview interaction, and the results of that interaction, transcripts, recordings, and analysis. So as you saw, Lee Stout made the oral history interview clearer by contrast with journalism, in that oral history is really a unique research methodology. It calls upon practitioners to actively create their sources. It's both a process and a product, but for the purposes of this talk and my research project, I'm going to refer only to the process, that is, the oral history interview interaction. So when I say oral history interview, oral history, I mean interview for the purposes of this talk. So oral historians see the interview as a way to access information about the past as connected with the present. To quote our own Ron Greeley, these interviews are conversational narratives, a kind of communication event with the goal of gathering information that complements and supplements existing historical records, while simultaneously constituting a self-standing, meaning-making record of human subjectivities. So my introduction to a theoretical account of the interview interaction took place primarily during my time in the OHMA program, the Oral History Master's Program, where with my fellow students, I engaged with the work of leading oral historians like Greeley, Alessandro Portelli, Lisa Passerini, Lynn Abrams, and others. So, to quote Abrams, an oral historian from whom I will borrow liberally throughout this talk, oral history is a dialogic process, a conversation in real time between the interviewer and the narrator within an area we might call external discourses or culture. Therefore, oral history is inherently a social process. So I found the sociological account of the oral history interview as a communication event most helpful. Indeed, it was the examination of symbolic interactionist literature, like the work of Charles Horton Cooley, George Herbert Mead, Herbert Bloomer, and Irving Goffman, incredibly helpful as I tried to understand what was happening in the course of the oral history interview. So symbolic interactionism, just to understand the field, refers to the simultaneous engagement of a conversation of gestures and use of significant symbols in everyday communication, to quote Mead. The field's major theorists, as I mentioned, are Cooley, Mead, Bloomer, Goffman. So just to begin, as I started thinking about the interview, I asked what would symbolic interactionists say happens during the oral history interview. So they might say that narrators construct and express social realities as a series of interactions based on meaning, symbols, and the underlying assumptions thereof. So turning to how I'm going to order the remainder of my talk. Arising out of this understanding and the continual practice of oral history interviewing, oral historians have constituted useful bodies of knowledge pertaining to the evolution of oral history interview practice, and they've offered an account of knowledge as arising from the interview for export to other engaged fields of study. So now with this core understanding in tow, allow me to tell you about how I'm going to structure this talk into two parts. First, I'm going to discuss a topic of interest to oral historians, that is, a theory of the relation of the social world to individual subjectivities, that is, the sociology of knowledge. And this will lead into a discussion of my empirical dissertation process, of my empirical dissertation project as it currently stands. Second, I will earnestly and tentatively approach a social epistemology of oral history interviewing by explaining four major oral history concepts and accounting for their bases and four fundamental aspects of the interview interaction. I approach these frames for reflection on oral history interviewing in order to understand the theoretical bedrock of the dissertation project and future projects that I hope to pursue. Okay. So to begin with, the sociology of knowledge. So the sociology of knowledge is an empirical study assessing the social conditions or causes of knowledge in a given society. The field was initiated by Karl Mannheim, who was under the influence of work by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. The clearest treatment for our purposes of this topic is The Social Construction of Reality by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. For sociologists of knowledge, the issue of the conditions of knowledge, that issue does not pertain to a philosophical project. Instead, it corresponds to the adoption of sociological approaches and methodologies to uncover the theories of knowledge active in the empirical social world. The field contends that knowledge is socially constructed, an understanding that relies on two premises. First, sociologists of knowledge consider the existence of an objective world as a given. This approach was adopted to avoid the philosophical project for which the tools of sociology often prove inadequate. Moreover, the field acknowledges that the man in the street regards social structures as social facts, that is, as objective reality. Though philosophers may rightly question their substantivity, people interact within social worlds as though their constituent parts intertwined. These intertwined symbolic universes were immutable, were fundamental, were inescapable. These beliefs become increasingly solidified over time through the processes of objectification and reification, causing actors to view the social world as a given. Interaction with these social structures produces a subjective reality. However, the full range of subjectivities constituting the social world are produced from earliest childhood, in which the child who possesses the capacity for sociality is more or less programmed by the subjectivities of others to view herself in a certain light. In the early development of children, along with comprehension of time and space and place, self arises as an organized collection of information adopted from interaction with other individual selves. Identity, then, takes shape as that imparted relation plus the relation of an individual self to the generalized other. That is, the omnipresence of a seemingly immutable social relations and structures. Thus, the interaction of the individual with the social reality to which he defers constitutes a form of social collective consciousness whose intellectual movements we can track. So, now I will offer a brief account of the development of oral history theory and practice in time through the lens of the sociology of knowledge. Today, we have a practice born of the struggle for legitimacy, reaching for maturity. Thus, oral historians have pushed for space and acknowledgement via the processes that Berger and Luckman term objectification, typification, sedimentation, legitimation, and reification. These processes ultimately aim toward the constitution of a symbolic universe with which individuals can interact. Oral historians have and continue to push when confronted, particularly when confronted by intellectual and political opponents. Among the strengths and tactics of oral history in this battle is the extension of oral history methodology into many enterprises, whether discipline practiced or community-oriented. This leads to a variety of practitioners engaging with oral history methods, which results in a kind of success across the humanities and social sciences, as well as outside academia, allowing divergent expertise to contribute to our field. As Alessandro Portelli so aptly says, oral history is permeable and borderless, a composite genre which requires that we think flexibly across and between disciplinary boundaries in order to make the most of this rich and complex source. Oral history is very different in the 21st century from the way it was conceived in the 20th. Focusing on oral history as practiced in the United States, we begin with former slaves who completed first-person autobiographical narratives in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. However, it was not until after the collection and recognition of American slave narratives collected in the 1930s as part of the federal works project that oral history became a sort of codified practice. Such archives failed to attract attention from academic historians, though, until many decades later, as they were considered, to quote Abrams, untrustworthy and unverifiable. Initially conceived and implemented at Columbia University by Alan Nevins, the purpose of archiving oral history for academic use was clear. That is, to collect the narratives of great men and retain them for posterity. In Europe, particularly in Britain and the Nordic countries, written records have also been favored over oral sources. However, the rediscovery of culturally significant folklore traditions, largely outside or at the fringes of academia, allowed oral history to develop across the pond. In the 1950s, and 60s, some oral historians gained national recognition. For instance, Stubbs Terkel, whose radio programs and books introduced oral history to the masses throughout the last half of the 20th century. The 1970s and 80s saw an expanded base of individuals familiar with oral history and greatly expanded discourse, including feminist, leftist, liberal approaches, and the field's increasing challenges to social scientific notions of validity. The field worked towards a legitimacy all its own, largely via the work of theorists and practitioners like our own Ron Greeley and Louisa Pasquini. The incorporation of additional practitioners into the field and growing self-acceptance of the uniqueness of the oral historian's claim to knowledge. It spoke epistemology, if you will. These days, oral history exists as an established practice of research, utilized and taught in disciplines as wide-ranging as technology, anthropology, sociology, healthcare studies, and psychology, as well as its use as an evidential tool in legal, medical, and caring environments. With the materials archived, there's valuable references in library and archival spaces around the world. So obviously I inhabit this later stage, and I engage with oral history as such. That is, as an established structure with rigid ideals and flexible practice. Thus I present the subject of my dissertation. Having defined and discussed the oral history interview, I recognize that beliefs concerning oral history may be shared and implemented to varying degrees in the broader field. I suspect that in discussions with oral history interviewers, one would hear substantial evidence of these knowledges concerning appropriate interview practices as distributed throughout the field. In addition, one might find relative silences, as practitioners approach oral history differently. Their approaches resonate and resemble, exploring the bounds of practice, sometimes escaping them. So I'm taking that project up. For my dissertation work, I will pursue an oral history project consisting of interviews with oral historians about their interview practices and the origin of those practices. And while reported behaviors certainly differ substantially from actual behaviors, I suspect that my study will yield interesting information concerning those practices with substantive buy-in across the field. That's why, versus those that have more limited adoption, excuse me. That's why I use this project's provisional title, Interviewing Interviewers About Interviewing. It is about reflecting with the practitioner in time about the practice via the practice. It's pretty meta. So for purposes of background research, I will assess dominant interviewing guides and accounts in oral history for dominant themes and specific recommendations. I will listen for their echoes or lack thereof in interviewee responses. With textual and discourse analysis tools, I will highlight the themes and recurrences, silences, providing some indication of the requirements and preferences of the field as a whole. Eventually, for comparative purposes, I may perform the same operation for long-form broadcast and/or print interviewers, offering a comparative analysis, as you heard earlier, from my oral history work. By examining another field's interviewing approach, I will examine that field's recommendations concerning the interview along with interviewers' reported practices, discussing how or if these standards are presented, transmitted, and/or ignored. Obviously, the direct comparison of reported interview standards and styles could prove to be a profitable opportunity, drawing the distinctness of each practice into starker relief. Perhaps my interviews will look something maybe a little bit like this.
Hard news interviews, fact gathering, information gathering interviews.
There are the confrontational interviews.
Interviews with superstars.
Interviewing interviewers.
Interviews with interviewers, about interviewing.
My name is Mike Wallace, and I'm a reporter. I'm Stubbs Turtle.
I'm Robert Walters. I pause because I never quite know what to say that I do. I guess television journalist would be about covering it.
I call myself a disc jockey who talks a lot. If you're going to do a job, you'd like people to pay attention to what you do in that job and how to separate yourself from the rest.
There is a point in an interview, if it's a personality interview, where or even if it isn't, I guess, where something goes bing and you know that you've gotten something special.
I guess what it comes down to is this. If you feel that I'm peering into a camera at this moment, and there's a big light here, and there's a light over there, and I've never talked to an interviewer who handled his own camera as you do.
But you can look at me, you don't have to look at the camera if you don't want to.
All right.
It's fine.
The most satisfying interview is the one in which you believe that you have gotten the interviewee to forget all about the mechanics. And people simply begin to talk, one to the other.
And after good interviews, that moment of acceleration, this happens a lot, is it?
Weird. Thanks, Skip Woodberg, for that clip. So maybe my interviews will look at some of that, or look like some of that, maybe without the time warp and the guy coming at the end, but nevertheless, I'm sure I will approach some of those topics as well. Okay, so moving on, I've got further questions, and those questions demand a new approach. So now that you know what my dissertation topic is, I really want to understand some of the bedrock understandings of oral history practice. Indeed, individual oral historians throughout the 20th century have, through their practice, worked towards self-determination against and through seemingly immutable academic structures, even as those same structures produce the oral historians themselves in many cases, and by extension, oral history theory and practice. According to Abrams, a history of oral history is one in which research, practice, and theory, that is, doing and interpreting, are deeply entwined and, in fact, emerge simultaneously. However, along the way, oral historians have, sometimes unreflectively, developed allegiances with theorists as they develop a largely internal account for their practice. Intentionally for some and unwittingly for others, oral historians have committed themselves to common beliefs concerning the interview. I would like to take the last 15 minutes of this talk to examine some of these beliefs and identify theorists in other fields, mainly in philosophy and sociology, whose work offers a thorough account, a complex account of some of these bedrock understandings concerning the pervasiveness of the social world within the interview interaction. Okay, so first and foremost, let me say I am not a philosopher. I'm not. And I'm not even going to attempt to be a philosopher. But what I will say is, I think it's certainly fair, as someone engaged in oral history practice, and fine to locate theorists whose works may speak somehow to ours, even and especially if or when we struggle to understand, as I often do. So with that in mind, I ask a seemingly simple question. What is oral history's account of the relevance of social relations, roles, interests, and institutions in the oral history interview? Understanding as we do that oral history theory has emerged and continues to emerge alongside practice. Thus, we are approaching a kind of democratic, almost a folk epistemology, if you will. Well, classical epistemology is many things, but democratic isn't necessarily one of them. So while we appeal to the most democratic, so I'm going to appeal to the most democratic approach I could find in epistemological studies. And it's the late 20th century philosophical dialectic called social epistemology, which uses classical epistemology as a base. So I'm going to use those works as a supplement to my broader conversation. So in what follows, I apply oral history to that dialectic, attempting to locate epistemic homes for bedrock concepts in oral history within it. So the core question is, what is the oral historian's theoretical basis for an understanding of what's happening in an oral history interview? And by extension, what are the working assumptions of our oral history practice? Okay, so to start, what is epistemology? So when we discuss epistemology, we discuss the philosophical approach to knowledge, its limitations, requirements, and nature. From its foundations, the study of epistemology has been concerned with many fundamental questions. These include the meaning of knowledge and understanding, the source or basis of knowledge, and the meaning of the terms I just mentioned. The study was motivated by a French philosopher, René Descartes' concern that much of apparent knowledge might not prove to be true. This worry prompted the foundationalist philosopher to write his famous Meditations on First Philosophy, wherein he confronts the possibility that all apparent knowledge could prove false, settling on the thesis, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. From this thesis, Descartes was able to constitute a theory of how other propositions could be validated based on cogito. All of epistemology from 1641 on is a response to Descartes' writings. Whether, for our purposes, whether Baconian, Lockean, or Humean, Enlightenment epistemology conceived of knowledge that is justified belief as resulting from the proper methods of engagement with perception and or the status of mental states. Thus, with regard to justification, social relations could only support another method, extend perception in order to support a method, or obfuscate true methods or knowledge. Thus, social relations were just not terribly useful to the study. Thus, testimony acted as either a sideshow to the primary work, or worse, it distracted from the primary work. And so testimonial beliefs, with which we're primarily concerned as oral historians, retained a secondary status. So with this very basic understanding of the emergence of epistemology as a dialectic, excuse me, please. Oh yes, excuse me. Okay, sorry. So what is social epistemology? Going back. But having explained how inherently social the interview interaction is, we would be remiss to apply these standards to our work. Social epistemologists, on the other hand, acknowledge a truth that seems readily apparent to the oral historian, that knowledge is arrived at, distributed, and perpetuated in, through, and by a social world. This prompted 18th century Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid to include testimonial belief as a component of the broader category of belief deriving from perception, for which robust justifications already existed. In doing so, Reid broke with the traditional assignment of secondary status to belief, indebted to social relations, that is, testimony. So in doing so, he founded social epistemology as a philosophical subject. So why does social epistemology matter? And matter for us? This is the term that is most relevant to our practice, oral history. For this, epistemological framework speaks directly to the elements of our practice and with which we are most preoccupied. However, it does call on us to explicate the bases of our practice and engage with them critically. So our question, with this basic understanding of the emergence of social epistemology as a dialectic, let's examine what it might say to dominant beliefs about oral history interviewing. And we should acknowledge that major theorists who social epistemologies and classical epistemologies speak to is the underpinnings of our practice. And the following schema is one of my own creation, and it's derived partially from the issues addressed by Abrams in her book, Oral History Theory. So this is how I'm going to approach it. So just for a foundation for what follows, questioning the epistemology of the oral history interview, what I really consider the most fundamental aspects of that interview scenario. Here I consider coherence as fundamental to narrative, subjectivity as fundamental to intersubjectivity, language as fundamental to performance, and self as fundamental to memory. Suffice to say that in the remainder of the talk, I will do the historical account of these dialectics no favors. What I aim to do instead is to explain the dominant oral historical approach to a concept, followed by a pinpointing of social epistemologists and their theories that may provide some epistemic backing to a generalized oral historical account. Okay, narrative and coherence. So, in discussing that relation, let's start with narrative. The word narrative is ubiquitous in oral history circles. It's a fundamental component of our practice. Narrative is one of the ways people make sense of and structure their experiences to communicate with themselves and others. It is a process of imposing order on the disorganized content of experience. The structure may incorporate any number of discursive elements, including cadences, dramatization, exaggeration, etc. And we do it automatically in our everyday interaction with others. Oral history has adopted the approach of allowing interviewees to construct their own meanings and therefore their own narratives. The ideal is to allow the interviewee to construct their own form of narrative coherence and style. So brief treatment of coherence and oral history. Oral history makes no claims to an objective truth, but it does make claims to subjective coherence and the opportunity for analysis that results. For oral historians, the goal of the interview is the achievement of narrative coherence. And indeed, narrative is a kind of coherence. And its appeal to oral historians is obvious. It is a natural component of the object of our study, which is testimony. On the basis of coherence, oral historians have become bolder proponents of the strength of our practice without resorting to attempts to prove the objective validity of interviewee accounts. Interesting considerations from epistemology, classical epistemology, include the weak individualism endorsed by David Hume, which acknowledged that there exist some beliefs which cannot and therefore need not be verified firsthand. This is the dominant view of testimony, and it requires that testimonial beliefs be justified, however, on the basis of non-testimonial beliefs. However, there exist multiple accounts of this weak individualism, and coherentism offers a close analogy to oral history's reliance on coherence as a way to validate an individual or collection of narratives. Based on the degree to which the collection of assertions, beliefs, and accounts makes sense in the context of a whole. And some coherentists with accounts that I found relevant to oral history include pragmatist William James, H. Bradley, W.B. Quine, Lawrence Bonjour, Wilfrid Sellers, Donald Davidson, and Bernard Bosanquet. Okay, so next I will address the relation of intersubjectivity to subjectivity. Oral historians recognize that the process of our work is necessarily multivocal, containing many voices and many socially situated perspectives or subjectivities. There is the interviewers, there's the interviewees, and any number of voices, roles, perspectives, and agencies that are brought along. This interplay is what oral historians call intersubjectivity. As a result, there may arise conflict between multiple constituent worlds. To quote Abrams, the descriptive character of these relations may vary substantially from interaction to interaction, but nevertheless, the fact of intersubjectivity is a necessary component of any consideration of oral history interviewing. Well, the bedrock of intersubjectivity is the idea of subjectivity. When we speak of subjectivity, we're referring to a perceiving subject, normally a person, and this contrasts with objectivity, which is the position of existence independent of perspective. Fortunately for oral historians, the epistemic debate over the subjectivity or objectivity of narrators is not in question. Every element of the oral history interview is subjective. Indeed, oral history is subjectivity. So for us, there's no escaping it. To quote Portelli, oral sources tell us not just what people did, but what they wanted to do, what they believed they were doing, and what they think they did. The earliest accounts of subjectivity can be found in the work of the German idealists Immanuel Kant and G.W. Hegel, later extended by Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, whose postmodern work provided for the deconstruction and analysis of the subject. Postmodern thinkers Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, and Pierre Bourdieu together integrated the subject into the social world, conceiving of it as a social construction. Third, testimony and language. So for this relation, we begin with testimony. So for oral historians, testimony is the material with which we work and the subject of our analysis. Testimony consists of two elements, speech and performance. Both are symbolic interactions, languages conveyed in order to enhance the audience's understanding and engagement. In storytelling, the two elements intertwine with one another over the course of a narrative. Meaning is conveyed both by the words themselves as well as by hand gestures, body postures, varied tones of voice. Oral historians make note of these aspects of the interview as they shift and mutate throughout the interaction. To quote Abrams, a formal question and answer session might mutate into a more formal dialogue or a conversational mode. Thus, oral historians adopt an open-ended approach, contending with the unexpected in every interaction. Thus, this intersubjective testimonial narrative, that's the stuff of oral history. And a thorough treatment of language in this context is impossible in the time allotted, and probably impossible generally. However, in consideration of the varied types of language embedded within the interview, the engagement of socially constructed symbolic worlds, and the vast web of foundational beliefs that must be held in common to facilitate speech, suffice to say that semantic theorists have much to say to oral historians. In particular, I would recommend an exploration of mediated reference theory as offered by Butler Frege and Bertrand Russell in the 19th and 20th centuries, as they separated the sense of a word from the reference of a word. This dialectic continues into the 20th and 21st centuries via the work of Wittgenstein, Sir Peter Strawson, and John Stowe. Exposition of modern and postmodern approaches to performance include the later Wittgenstein. Postmodern approaches to performance include the dramaturgical literature of Irving Goffman and the epistemology of the later Wittgenstein structuralist Ferdinand Saussure, post-structuralist philosopher Jacques Lacan, and Saul Kripke, who foreshadow the preoccupation of art with the subjective realities of social life. And last but not least, I'm going to address the relation of memory to self. Oral historians understand interviews as an entry point situated in the present to access the past. Indeed, our interviewees are products of memory. Our historical documents, that is to say our interviewees, are particularly capable of inaccuracy and bias. But oral historians view this as an opportunity to examine why the narratives are that way, why is emphasis given to certain moments, to certain memories, and not to others. Presences and silences reveal a great deal about the social order the interviewee inhabits and with which she interacts. Memory studies is a vast subfield of oral history studies, generally focusing on collective memory, into which I will not delve. But suffice to say that oral historians do not view memory in a passive sense. On the contrary, with each telling a narrative, memory reconstitutes itself. Although memory feels personal, it is always influenced by shared memories and silences, as in Luisa Pasolini's work on Italian fascism. However, memory is also, in the neuroscientific sense, a mechanical retrieval, encoding, and storing of memory in various parts of the brain. With each of these understandings of memory, we confront the potential, indeed the guarantee, of memory's fallibility, both in the interpretive and mechanical sense. So with memory, we have to understand self. When interviewees produce memory, they address the persistence of their selves over time and space. In doing so, I reflect on the history of a me, its allegiances, conceptions, and purposes, but never its perceptions, as me neither thinks nor feels. This negotiation between a conscious actor and that actor's existence in the social world is a mutable process, never fully captured. Symbolic interactionist George Herbert Mead would say that self is present when the mind interacts either with itself via internal dialogue or with another self, casting an image capable of being analyzed and adjusted. Epistemological assessments of the self follow Descartes' dualist concept of the body's relation with the soul, that is, a mechanic, material entity interacting with the non-material mind. Jean Locke conceived of consciousness as the basis of personal identity, and later David Hume conceived of the self as a commonwealth, in which the whole is constituted by parts. The loss of a part does not necessarily mean the loss of the whole. The notion of an individualized self, a self that is unique, distinguished from others, it derives from the Cartesian epistemological project, the foundation of classical and social epistemology. As oral historians, we share a commitment to self-narrating performative testimony, though we utilize varied methods to achieve those ends. Since narrative, intersubjectivity, performance, and memory are fundamental to our practice as oral historians, likewise, coherence, subjectivity, language, and self should be fundamental considerations as well. These dialectics form a bedrock often hidden from the practitioner. Nevertheless, our understanding of them deeply affects oral history interviewing in theory and in practice. Our treatment of these topics finds interlocutors in philosophical and sociological disciplines, so it is prudent to examine them for our views. This is especially the case given oral history's definite, though occasionally overblown, intellectual and political potential across a multitude of fields and within our own. We should examine these conclusions to see if they serve our purposes well, as it is constructive for a field to identify areas of interest and to create conversation around them. I do so with the hope that as we advance our oral history practice, we will also advance our theoretical account, as our field has done for nearly a century. So, I hope that this talk proves somewhat clear. I'm aware that I glossed over a great deal of important topics, but I hope that it is giving you all, particularly the oral historians, some understanding of the progression of our field's knowledge of the oral history interview from the vantage of sociology of knowledge and social epistemology, of the field's struggle for legitimacy and historical context despite the complexities of using living source material, and its understanding of the social world and interview practice. And if not, at the least I hope that I have increased somewhat your interest in the fundamental questions of oral history interviewing and raised your awareness of some thinkers outside our field who engage them. So, that's my talk.
Thank you.